All right, welcome back. Now we are going to listen and discuss our first panel, the basics on economic security. And maybe first, obviously, we know that it's sometimes hard to squeeze everything about in 15 minutes, but it would be great if you could stick to the routine in order for everyone to have the same amount of time to present. And please, if you speak, just for all speakers, use the microphone over there because this is important for our stream and for the camera and stuff. And then I think we can just start with Mr. Fechter, Jonas Fechter. He will be our first speaker. For a short introduction, he studied law in Berlin and in London and completed afterwards his legal clerkship at the Court of Appeal in Frankfurt am Main. And then he worked as a research assistant at a chair for public law with a special emphasis on administrative sciences, cultural and religious law of Professor Hinek Wisman in Münster. So the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction. And I want to talk with you today about geoeconomic analysis of law. That's an idea that I came up with towards the end of my PhD. It's a theory in the making, so I'm very curious on what you're going to have to say about it later in the discussion. And I want to pursue this presentation in 3 steps. So first of all, I want to talk with you about the concept of geoeconomics. That's a buzzword that's been around for a while, and I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with it, but I want to repeat some of the core tenets of geoeconomics and kind of shape it in the way I think about it. Then the second step is that I want to talk about economic analysis of law. That's a completely different thing in a way. It's about economic law, but I believe it can kind of serve as a blueprint for geoeconomic analysis of law, as the name already suggests. So am I well understood here? Okay, good. And then the third step is actually talking about geoeconomic analysis of law. So let's move on to the first part, to the concept of geoeconomics. So when we talk about the concept of geoeconomics, it's very helpful to give a brief history of the liberal international order, and thankfully Lothar covered a lot of it already, so I can make it brief. The liberal international order, that's a term from international relations theory, really took off really had its inception point at the end of the Cold War in about 1990, and we are all familiar with Francis Fukuyama's famous sentence that the end of history has arrived, and by that he meant that there's really no viable conceptual alternative to Western liberalism, and we all kind of believed that, and well, we found it differently later on. What is the liberal international order? Well, it's really all about political liberalism, but it's also about economic liberalism. And the economic principles of the liberal international order that are important for us here are about economic integration and efficiency, again, what Lothar covered earlier on. Economic integration is about making the market size larger. You integrate markets to a worldwide, ideally, market, and that yields efficient results because you don't have to produce everything for your own tiny market, but you can produce for the entire world and thus make processes more efficient. In order to facilitate that, the liberal international order and its proponents created a certain or a specific institutional setup, especially with international institutions such as famously the World Trade Organization, but also decentralized institutions such as international investment treaties, institutions and also regimes, as you say in international relations theory. And all of this process is kind of undergrid by the famous theory of David Ricardo of comparative advantages, which he developed towards the beginning of the 19th century or the end of the 18th century, I believe. And he argues that if countries focus on the things they can produce with a comparative advantage and trade for the rest, then the pie grows bigger and we are all wealthier, we all have more money. So for example, if a country like Germany is good in manufacturing or especially high-end engineering, then we should focus on that and trade for the rest, because it will yield a higher sort of profit margin for us and also for other countries. So it's a win-win kind of situation. All right. But arguably, and it seems from the first speech that this is a little bit contested, but we have all kind of observed a disintegration of this liberal international order, and that is because of certain geopolitical competition processes which became kind of visible already in 2010, maybe a little bit later. And there are a few points on there, for instance, the rise of China. Obviously not the rise of China itself, but the kind of processes and systematic challenges that this rise of China poses. The Ukraine war recently, the Iran war, but also, speaking from a Western point of view, internal processes such as Brexit and populism. This has led to institutional fragmentation, which is most visibly in the World Trade Organization, but with regard to the European Union, also when we think about Brexit, for instance. Now, there are theories in international relations scholarship that can kind of explain the inner mechanics of this process. And one very strong theory on this point is realism, or as it's called now, neorealism. And realism is really the opposite of liberalism and institutionalism. Now, one important point is, I'm not saying that realism explains everything, it certainly doesn't, and it raises some eyebrows with some people, but it can capture some processes that I believe that we are currently observing. The core tenet of realism really is that the international system is an anarchical system. And anarchy in this sense means that there is no overarching government, no overarching structure that can enforce rights and treaties and rules and law, such as you have within the state monopoly in a government. And this fact leads to the process of security competition, because every country and every nation stands for itself in this theory, because states can never be sure that other states are going to observe laws and are observing their rights, and therefore they have to make sure, a process of self-help, that they are secure themselves, that they have enough power. So the international system, from this point of view, is not one of cooperation, is not one where countries work together, but rather it's zero-sum game politics. It's not growing the pie together, it's about I have to win, because if you win, then I will lose. And this is obviously an inversion of the Ricardo model of international trade. So the focus is really hard power or state power, and state power comes in two forms: hard power, military power, economic power. That is obviously what we are going to focus on today, economic power, but also things like soft power, for instance, if you control like media markets like Instagram and TikTok, etc. All right. Now moving on to the concept of geoeconomics. The concept of geoeconomics is really just an extension of a theory of realism, right? It's state conflicts in the economic realm. The term was coined in 1990 by a scholar called Edward Lookworth from the United States, and he said, and this is a quote up there, "This neologism, geoeconomics, is the best term I can think of to describe the admixture of the logic of conflict with the methods of commerce, the logic of war in the grammar of commerce." So it's really about conflict, security competition with economic means. Not with military means, but with economic means. All right, so much for geoeconomics. Now moving on to the second part, I want to talk briefly about economic analysis of law and present it as a role model for geoeconomic analysis of law. Now, what are the fundamentals of economic analysis of law, or law and economics, as we say? The background, the intellectual background, is utilitarian philosophy. Jeremy Bentham is to be mentioned here. And in the economic realm, it's really about the focus on efficiency, making market processes more efficient, again, to provide the greatest benefit for the greatest amount of people. Now, there are different concepts to measure efficiency. I won't go into deep here. Pareto criterion, Kaldor-Hicks criterion, and those are criteria to kind of measure how efficient a law or a measure is. Importantly, you need a behavioral model to measure how human beings behave and whether the processes associated with them will be efficient. And the behavioral model, famously, is Homo economicus. Now, what is Homo economicus? Well, first of all, it's a methodologically individualist theory. We look at the individual. We look how the consumer acts. We look at how the taxpayer acts. We look at how every one of you acts. And then we assume that you act in your own self-interest, you're not acting in the interest of somebody else, you're acting in your own interest, and you act rationally. You do not act irrationally, you pursue a different goal every day, but you do so rationally. Secondly, law and economics has different methodological aspects. It's not just about interpreting the law, it's also about analyzing the law. The first dimension would be the positive dimension. We simply look at the law from an outside perspective and ask ourselves whether the law yields efficient results. What will happen? It's essentially a forecasting process. It's not necessarily a legal process in the strict sense. But it also has a normative dimension. We ask whether a law, how the law should be changed, what the law ought to be like in order to yield those results that we want to have. And thirdly, you also have a statutory interpretation dimension. We can also, if we know that the law is there to yield efficient results, then we can use it as a measure to, or as an interpretative tool, and ask ourselves, how should the law be interpreted so that at the end of the day it will yield efficient results. Now you can critique all of that. I won't go deep into that because it's a large debate and we don't have much time for that. All right. Moving on to the last part, geoeconomic analysis of law. Now I try to tie together the 2 points I've made before. How can we use economic analysis of law as a blueprint for a geoeconomic analysis of law? Now let's start again with some of the fundamentals, and a lot of that will sound hopefully familiar to you now. What is the intellectual background of such a geoeconomic analysis of law? Well, it's realist theory. It's geoeconomic international relations theory. It's the focus on security, and especially in our context, economic security in an anarchic international system without any rules, so to speak. The concept of economic security, thankfully, this has already been covered by Lothar a lot. We don't really have a definition of it yet, also not in the political realm. We have some criteria set out, especially in the 2023 economic security strategy by the European Commission, where the European Commission sets out a few risks to economic security. So it's kind of an inductive definition, as it were: risks to resilient supply chains, risks to critical infrastructure, risks to technology security, and also weaponized interdependence. So those would be some of the kind of aspects. It's a bit blurry, but I think it suffices for now. Importantly, we need a new behavioral model. We can't use Homo economicus because we're not in a liberal economic setting here. We need a behavioral model for the, as I would call it, the geoeconomic state. How does the geoeconomic state act? First of all, we don't look at individuals. We don't look at how you would act, how an individual government official would act. We'd rather look at how states act, with the European Union obviously being a difficult case. As you mentioned, the European Union isn't a state, but it's certainly not just an institution like the World Trade Organization. It's something in between. Again, we could go into that a little deeper, but I will refrain from that in the interest of everyone. But how does the state, the geoeconomic state, act? And the actions of the state, in my opinion, would actually be very similar to Homo economicus. The geoeconomic state acts out of self-interest and rationally. Doesn't mean he always acts like that, and in fact, a lot of governments do not act like that, but in the model, the geoeconomic state acts like that. And what are the self-interests of the geoeconomic states? It's not about growing the economy. It's about power and security, and also economic security. Now, of course, part of that can be that you want to grow your economy to have more influence. But it's not just about providing more healthcare services for your citizens, etc. It's about making sure you control the economy to the maximum point you can, controlling choke points in economic networks and the like. So the focus is not on growing the pie for everyone, it's about relative gains. If you win, I lose, so I need to win so that you lose. That's the theory. I know it's not a nice theory, but that would be kind of, and I'm not saying that all legislation at the end of the day should just do that, but it's a theory that helps us to kind of factor in those geoeconomic aspects. So security interests override economic interests in this model. My last point, what are the methodological aspects of geoeconomic analysis of law? Well, they are quite similar actually to law and economics. We also have a positive dimension. We can just ask ourselves from this point of view, from this background, how do certain laws behave, or what results do they yield from this geoeconomic point of view? We can do that with, obvious examples such as investment screening. Does it strengthen the economic security of the European Union and the member states, or does it not? But, and that's an important point, it's not limited to geoeconomic instruments. You can apply that, just as law and economics, to just every instrument, or as Daniel Dresner would have said, everything is now about national security. Let's take an obvious example, the AI Act. The AI Act is, at its core, I would say, about fundamental rights in the AI era. There's some other aspects, but that's the fundamental point. But we can, so it's not a geoeconomic instrument, at least not the focus of it. But we can ask ourselves from a geoeconomic point of view, what does it do from a geoeconomic point of view? Does it strengthen the economic security of the European Union? Some would argue yes, maybe. Some would argue, well, it actually overregulates and therefore could potentially hamper the ability of European companies to compete with, let's say, Chinese, Indian, and American companies in the AI sector. Secondly, normative dimension. We can ask ourselves, from the geoeconomic state point of view, how should we improve the law? Well, we just have a review of the investment screening regulations, so that could be a part of it. And then lastly, statutory interpretation. Once we have established that a certain instrument, you can only do that with geoeconomic instruments really, is about strengthening the economic security of the European Union, such as investment screening, we can actually use those tools to interpret the key legal terms. Let's take, for instance, security and public order and investment screening law. And we have a very old definition of the European Court of Justice for security and public order. In my humble opinion, I think it's a defunct definition for investment screening, and it's also not, from a legal point of view, in my opinion, necessary to transfer it to this new term. Instead, we should look at it from a geoeconomic point of view and an economic security point of view and reinterpret that term. And by the way, it's also a little bit of a different term, it's security and public order, so that would also be a reason. Anyways, we don't have time for the critique now, but I'm very much looking forward to, well, first of all, the other presentations, but then secondly, also to your comments. Thank you very much for your attention.